Ani Bojo, it's Mary Lynn Houston Leask here from Mawakadong Indigenous Friendship Center in Owen Sound. Today I'm going to do a little instructional video on how to preserve some of the herbs and medicinal plants that you might be harvesting during the summer and fall months. And today I'm going to do a fairly simple one on how to do calendula cream. And calendula cream or ointment is really great for babies and people with sensitive skin. And just to give you a little bit of background about a calendula or pot marigold. A lot of people know it as pot marigold. This is not a plant that is native or indigenous to North America. It was actually brought here by European settlers. So there's probably a lot of more history on the medicinal use of this plant in Europe and some parts of Asia than there might be in North America. But it grows very well in this climate, and a lot of people have it in their garden and just use it as an ornamental and have no idea about the medicinal value of it. So these are calendula flowers, just so you sort of know what it looks like, and you probably have seen it. Maybe your aunt grows it, or maybe your neighbor has some, and it grows really well here. This plant is considered a self-seeding annual, and what that means is that each year new plants grow up from new roots. So it's not like a perennial flower like rudbeckia or echinacea, other plants that grow up from the same plant each year. What happens is these plants grow quite well and fairly prolific, and as the flower dies back, it creates seeds. The seeds fall down into the earth. Next spring, those seeds start new plants. So that's what we call a self-seeding annual. It comes up each year annually, but it seeds down to produce new plants. Most of these flowers will start blooming sometime in early July. Depends on how much sun exposure your plants get. If they're in an area with lots of sun, lots of light, lots of heat on a warm part of the house, then they may start flowering a little earlier. And they usually will continue flowering right until the fall and the frost comes and kills the plants back. So I've picked a number of these during the flowering season. And what I do to preserve them, I pick them on a sunny day when the dew has being dried off of the plant. I get a little jar, like you can see here. Some has been sitting for quite a while. And I get a jar, I fill it up with the calendula flowers. Just the flowers themselves. Make sure there's no bugs on them. You'd be surprised how many bugs try to trespass and hitch a ride on flowers. And I fill up a jar, and quite compact if you can. And then we're going to cover it with a good quality oil. And this can be an organic oil that you buy at the grocery store. It definitely wants to be something that's food grade, so not mineral oils, only things that you'd ingest. So things you find in the grocery store that you could eat and use in either cooking or baking. And I've got one here that's just 100% sunflower oil. It's an organic product, and you could probably be able to find it in your local grocery store without being prohibitively expensive. And then I'm going to cover the flowers all the way to the top. We really want to make sure that none of the plant material is above the level of the oil, or you could start to get mold growth on them. You really want to make sure that they're entirely covered with the oil. This is the very same process you would use if you were also preserving lavender flowers, which a lot of people do, or if you were preserving St. John's wort, other medicinal things that you might use oils for. Mullein seeds. A lot of people think of mullein as sort of Ontario's cactus plants. So they're very tall, thin, sometimes 6 or 7 feet tall, with a long cylindrical flower that are little and yellow all the way along. And a lot of people use those for medicinal uses as well. So you could use the same process for processing those oils. Then I'd put it in an area where you'll notice it, where you're not going to forget that you started this process. So for me, that usually means on a counter or in a window ledge, where an area of the kitchen that I'm going through quite frequently. And at least once a day, you want to go through and kind of swirl it around. The reason for doing this is just to distribute the constituents of the medicinal qualities of the flower, but also to make sure that all the plant matter is down below the top surface of the oil so that it won't be going bad. After a few weeks, 2 to 3 weeks of making sure that the oil and the flowers are well infused, you can take the lid off and you can use a sieve, piece of cheesecloth, an old piece of sort of porous material that you have, and you can sieve off the plant material, so all the flowers and the little bit of stems that might be in there, and just to preserve the oil, if you prefer. I often will just leave the flowers and the plant matter in. This one's been sitting probably since the latter part of July, and then I put it in the fridge. The reason I put it in the fridge is just to ensure that I'm not getting any mold or anything else growing in it, and it's remaining true to the qualities that I want from the plant. And you can store it in the fridge, and you may notice that it sort of, depending upon the temperature of your fridge, it may start to almost solidify. It may start to take on more of a look of coconut oil or butter. That's totally fine. And you can leave it in the back of the fridge. I would mark it if you're like me and have several and aren't sure what you put in there. You might want to mark what it is and when you put it in there. And then you can pull them out over the winter or different times of the year to use in your creams. So these are the base, the medicinal part of the base of the cream that we're going to be making today. So this has been sitting around since July, and it's got the medicinal parts of the calendula that I'm wanting to use in the cream, or the base that I'm using today. And making base creams is pretty similar to most cultures all over the world. They'll use whatever reliable source of fat that they have available, whether that be for us today, we were going to be using some of the sunflower oil again, but we're also going to be using a saturated fat. Saturated fats, by definition, are fats that at room temperature, sort of like I have in the kitchen today, would remain in a solid form. So as you can see, this coconut oil that I've purchased, and once again, you can get these at pretty much any grocery store these days, it's in a solid form. So it looks sort of like butter. It's not going to pour out when I flip it upside down. But if I heated it at a fairly low temperature, it will come into a liquid form. So it melts at a relatively low temperature, which means when we put it on our skin is warmer obviously than the room temperature, it melts rather readily and will be absorbed by our skin. Different parts of the world, they would have used different things. So local in the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation territory, probably readily available sources of fats would have been bear grease, and a lot of local medicinal creams and ointments would have used bear grease as their base for the kinds of medicinal creams that we're talking about today. Just for convenience sake, for most of you who perhaps don't have somebody hunting in your family, coconut oils can be really great. You could also use butters. Butters do have a little bit less shelf life as far as how long they can go without being refrigerated. But coconut oil is fairly stable. It's fairly readily available in grocery stores and not too cost prohibitive. So this jar of coconut oil I bought at a grocery store, and it was about $7.99, and would make quite a bit of oil for us. So what I'm going to do, also forgot my beeswax. I'll be right back. Beeswax is something that most of us can find from a local honey shop. If you have local neighbors or relatives who have beehives or know somewhere that you get your local honey, they probably are also going to be selling their beeswax. And the beeswax is a byproduct of honey and honey production, and the bees produce this for us. And this is what is going to sort of solidify the cream for us, make it a little thicker consistency, and also keep it a little bit more stable in hot summer days when our room temperature is going to be a little bit warmer. This will keep the whole ointment from going completely liquid or giving it a little bit more thicker consistency. And this is something you can play around with. There are no hard and fast rules of making these kinds of creams and ointments. You can play around with the recipe to get the base to be the consistency you like. So if you like ointments that go on a little thicker, you're probably going to put in more beeswax. If you would like them to be something that goes on fairly smooth and is readily absorbed by the skin or the surface that it's on, we're probably going to be putting in more of the ointment or the oil because it will stay in a liquid state even in room temperature. So what I usually do when I'm making the creams is I do my beeswax first. Because it is solid, it does take a higher heat to bring it into a liquid form. And we need to bring everything into a liquid form for it to mix together and then pour into our jars. So I take a grater, just a regular kitchen grater. It does kind of muck it up a little bit when you put the wax on it. So if you have an old one or one that you don't mind getting a little bit or having to do a little bit of work afterwards to get the beeswax out, you will have to almost boil it to get the beeswax off of it. You need to, I'm going to make fairly small little containers. So these are our little mason jar containers. Doesn't have to be a mason jar. If you have something around already at home, use what you already have. But you will want it to be glass. And make sure it's sort of an open, that the top opening of it is fairly easy and readily accessible. If they're too deep, it's hard to get your hand too far down. So I would suggest something that is fairly shallow. And you may be already getting nut butters or other things at the store that come in jars that would do and suffice. So don't go out and buy something new for them. I'm going to be using these fairly small ones. So for a jar about this size, which is about 125 milliliters of content, I'm going to be, for me, for the consistency I like of the creams and lotions that I use, I'm going to be grating up about 5 tablespoons of this beeswax. And that can be hard to measure. So after a while, you'll get to know just how much beeswax you like in yours. And then I will add to it probably about a quarter of a cup of the liquid calendula oil, or whatever you've used as your medicinal base for this, whether it be peppermint oil or lavender oil with a wonderful smell. Peppermint is really nice for if you're wanting a fairly calming for foot massage or just for foot creams. Peppermint is really, really nice, and it's very invigorating smell and commonly available too. Then I'm going to be putting in probably the major portion of your whole mixture is going to be the coconut oil or whatever you're using as a solid saturated fat base. If you do have access to bear grease, you would be using that as well. And I'm probably going to be putting into about a quarter of a cup, maybe a little bit more, of the coconut oil. Putting all that mixture together in a fairly good thick bottomed pot, I'm going to be putting it on about medium heat and stirring rather consistently. Don't go anywhere off while you're doing this portion of it, because it does burn rather readily and would wreck all your medicinal oils that you're putting into it, as well as it is a fire risk. We're talking about fats. So stay close by, make sure it's maybe when the baby is asleep or is preoccupied doing something else with another person in the household. Stir that really well, and you will find that for sure the beeswax is going to be the last portion of the base of the cream that is going to melt, because the beeswax is something that needs a higher temperature and a little bit longer before it'll come to liquid. Once you've got a nice liquid base from everything, you're going to pour that very carefully into, and I've just done this about a half hour ago, so you can see as it's cooling, the bottom portion of the cream is starting to solidify, and we've still got liquid on the top. That's okay. It's the process of totally cooling will take sometimes as long as 24 hours, depends on how warm the air temperature is in your house. If you want to speed it up a little bit, you can at the tail end put it in the refrigerator. I wouldn't do that right away because the glass jar is very hot right now, so I would leave it out for at least 12 hours, sort of see the consistency. What's great about this process, because there are no hard and fast rules, if you find that after 24 hours, that's probably the consistency that it's going to remain at. If after 24 hours you still find it's too liquid, it's almost still as if it is a liquid, you haven't wrecked anything. Put it back in your pot, heat it up again, put a little bit more beeswax with it. That'll make it a little thicker consistency. Put a couple of tablespoons of the grated beeswax in, melt it again, pour it into your jar, let it sit for 24 hours. If it still isn't the consistency you like, you just do the whole process all over again. So if you want it to be thicker, put in more beeswax, small amount, tablespoon or 2 at a time, to kind of slowly build up to what you're hoping for. If it's too thick, if it feels like a block of wax and there's just no going on the skin, absolutely put in a little bit more of the coconut oil or your base. If it's really, really thick, you can even add just a little bit straight up of a good quality oil, like you put in the base for the medicinal. Once again, reheat it, make sure everything's liquefied, put it back in your jar, wait 24 hours, and see if that's consistency that is more agreeable to you. For small babies, if you're using it for diaper rash creams, just for massage oils for your baby, especially calendula, it's very something that they can ingest if they have it on their hands or their body parts and not be a concern as far as them eating it. You probably want something that's fairly easy and is going to blend into their skin fairly quickly. So start off maybe with a little less beeswax and work your way up. If you're using it for other members of the family or for medicinal creams for yourself with specific purposes, you can custom make them into whatever way you want them to have. Once this has solidified and I'm happy with the consistency of it, For long-term storage, if you're putting this out on the diaper change area that you have for your baby, probably 3 or 4 months, you'll be fine that it won't go bad on you or rancid, or that the texture won't change any. Really between 3 and 4 months, if it's going to be out longer than that, you might want to keep it in the fridge and just bring it out as needed. In the fridge, they'll probably last well over a year, just having the colder environment to stay in. Fats do, especially good quality organic fats, do go rancid at a much higher rate than those that are heat processed and what we call hydrolyzed fats. Those ones have a longer shelf life, but they also have some other chemicals and things, especially for babies that are ingesting them, we may not want to necessarily have for them in large quantities. So using good quality organic oils ensures that there's no risk for babies taking them into their body and eating them, but it also means that we are giving up a little bit of shelf life. It's a good trade-off, I think. So put them in the fridge if you're going to be using them long-term, or you're not sure how frequently you're going to be using them. You can buy these nifty little plastic lids at most of the grocery stores around these days, and then you can just put it on your cream once it has totally liquefied, or solidified, sorry. So that's the base process of how to make ointments or creams with medicinal flowers or herbs. And I hope you'll experiment a little bit and enjoy. Have any questions, you can get a hold of me at Mawukwadong at cpnpmawukwadong.com, or you can give me a call or send me a message on the Facebook or on this YouTube channel. Thank you. Miigwech.